Rain hammered against the windshield of Dr. Amara Okoro's sedan, a relentless rhythm that matched the pulsing exhaustion in her temples. It was 2 a.m., and she was miles from the city, stranded on a shoulder of roads swallowed by the Georgia pines, her car's engine a cold, dead weight. Most people would have locked their doors and waited for help. But Amara wasn't most people. When she heard the low, rhythmic blaring of a horn coming from a blacked-out pickup truck 20 yards ahead, she didn't see a threat. She heard a distress signal. She stepped out into the downpour, her navy blue medical scrubs clinging to her skin, the stethoscope around her neck a cold reminder of the life she'd chosen. As she approached the idling truck, the smell hit her first, the sharp, metallic tang of iron mixed with expensive leather. She pulled the heavy door open, and the dome light flickered on, revealing a scene that would have paralyzed a lesser person. Slumped over the steering wheel was a man who looked like he had been carved out of stone and then shattered. He was shirtless, his bronze skin a canvas for an intricate, swirling sea of traditional Irezumi tattoos, inked dragons winding up his neck and tigers leaping across his ribs. But the art was being drowned in red. Jagged lacerations tore across his chest, and a deep wound on his forearm was pumping blood with terrifying consistency. This was Lee Seo-jun, though Amara didn't know his name yet. She didn't know he was the Tiger of Seoul, a man whose whisper could collapse a market, and whose glare could end a life. To her, he wasn't a shadow of the underworld. He was a patient in hypovolemic shock. Her hands, steady despite the freezing rain, went straight to his carotid artery. His pulse was thready and frantic, like a bird trapped in a cage. "Stay with me," she hissed, her professional veneer hardening into a shield. She ignored the suppressed firearm tucked into the door pocket and the stacks of banded currency on the floor mat. She reached for the emergency kit she always carried, her mind already calculating the cc's of blood lost. This was the night the Hippocratic Oath ceased to be a graduation memory and became a survival manual. To the world, this man was a monster. To Amara, he was a heartbeat she refused to let stop. In that cramped, blood-slicked cabin, the doctor and the king were bound by a single, desperate thread of life. As she pressed the first layer of gauze to his skin, she had no idea she was stepping into a war she wasn't trained to fight. The sky over the backroads of Georgia hadn't just opened up, it had collapsed. Dr. Amara Okoro gripped the steering wheel of her sedan, her knuckles prominent and pale against the dark skin of her hands. She had just finished a grueling 18-hour shift at the trauma center, a marathon of shattered limbs and frantic surgeries that had left her mind buzzing with a weary, restless electricity. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge, throwing rhythmic, blurred shadows across her focused face. Then, the shudder happened. It started in the gas pedal, a hollow, mechanical cough, before the dashboard lights flickered once and plunged into darkness. The engine gave a final, wheezing gasp, leaving Amara coasting into the muddy shoulder of the road. Silence rushed into the cabin, heavy and absolute, broken only by the violent, metallic drumming of rain on the roof. "Not tonight," she whispered, resting her forehead against the wheel for a fleeting second. She was miles from the city, trapped in a corridor of towering pines that felt more like a cage than a forest in the pitch black. She reached for her phone, but the screen showed a mocking "No service." As a surgeon who prided herself on being the master of her environment, the sudden helplessness was a bitter pill to swallow. She was about to resign herself to a long, shivering night in the back seat when a sound sliced through the white noise of the storm. It wasn't the roar of wind or the crack of a branch. It was a horn, long, steady, and rhythmically haunting. Honk. 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 It was coming from a massive, charcoal-black pickup truck parked haphazardly 50 yards ahead, its nose tilted precariously into a ditch. In the gloom, the truck looked like a predatory shadow, its engine silent but its horn crying out in a mechanical pulse. Amara's eyes narrowed. That wasn't an alarm, and it wasn't a signal for a tow. It was the sound of a body, the dead weight of someone who had slumped forward and lost the strength to pull themselves back. Her exhaustion didn't vanish, but it was instantly catalogued away, replaced by the clinical coldness she used when a code red echoed through the hospital corridors. She didn't think about the isolation of the road or the potential danger of a stranger in the dark. She reached for the heavy-duty medical kit she kept in the passenger footwell, checked the stethoscope around her neck, and stepped out into the mud. The wind whipped her navy scrubs against her frame as she began to run toward that rhythmic cry, her doctor first, instinct overriding every survival nerve in her body. She didn't know it yet, but the road wasn't just broken. It was leading her into a world where the laws of medicine were the only thing left to protect her. The rain was a cold, unrelenting curtain, but Amara's focus was a laser. She reached the door of the charcoal black truck, her fingers slipping against the wet chrome. The horn was a physical weight against her eardrums now, relentless, mourning, and loud enough to vibrate in her chest. She hooked her fingers into the handle and pulled with everything she had, the seal finally giving way with a wet, heavy thud. As the door swung open, the truck's interior light flickered to life, illuminating a scene that felt ripped from a dark, ancient myth. Slumped against the steering wheel was a man who looked as though he had been carved out of stone. Amara didn't hesitate. She reached in, her hands already moving with clinical precision. She gripped his shoulders, her strength surprising even herself as she pulled him back from the steering wheel to silence the horn. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by his ragged, shallow breathing and the frantic drumming of rain on the roof. He was shirtless, his body a breathtaking canvas for an intricate, sprawling sea of traditional Irezumi ink. Powerful dragons coiled around his muscular torso, their scales shimmering under the dim cabin light, while tigers with bared teeth lunged across his chest, frozen in a silent, inked roar. It was a display of status and strength, a map of a life lived in the shadows. But the artistry was being drowned. Fresh, jagged lacerations tore through the dragon's coils, and a deep wound on his forearm was pumping crimson blood, staining the vibrant ink and dripping onto the expensive leather upholstery. The visual contrast was jarring. Amara, with her dark skin and hair elegantly styled in a focused, low-braided bun, stood over him in her crisp navy blue scrubs. She was the embodiment of modern medicine, a beacon of sterile order and professional discipline in a cabin that smelled of copper, rain, and expensive cologne. Her stethoscope, draped around her neck, caught the flickering light as she leaned in, her eyes scanning the damage with an intensity that ignored the mystery of the tattoos. Lee Seo-jun didn't look at her. Even as his life force leaked onto the floorboards, he kept his head turned toward the darkened window, his sharp, weathered features set in a mask of stoic defiance. His short-cropped black hair was matted with rain, and though his body was failing, his eyes remained alert, scanning the perimeter of the dark woods as if he were still the hunter rather than the prey. There was an undeniable aura of authority about him, a gravity that even blood loss couldn't diminish. "Look at me," Amara commanded, her voice steady and resonant. She didn't wait for him to comply. She pressed a thick pad of white gauze to the jagged wound on his forearm, the fabric immediately turning a deep, dark red. Her focused gaze met the edge of a tattooed dragon's wing on his neck. "I'm a doctor. You're in shock, and if you don't let me stop this bleeding right now, you aren't going to make it." The man finally shifted his gaze. His eyes were dark, piercing, and entirely devoid of the fear she usually saw in trauma patients. For a heartbeat, they simply stared at one another, the surgeon in navy blue and the king of the underworld in his coat of ink and blood. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, he leaned back, granting her silent permission to save his life. The sound of Lee Seo-jun's breathing changed, shifting from a ragged gasp to a wet, desperate whistle. Amara felt the shift in the air of the cabin immediately. Her hand moved from his pulse to his chest, feeling the uneven rise and fall of his ribs. One side was stagnant, a silent tomb for the air he couldn't use. His skin was turning a haunting shade of ashen gray, and the veins in his neck were bulging with the pressure of a heart being squeezed by its own surrounding air. "Tension pneumothorax," she whispered, her voice a sharp blade of clarity against the roar of the rain. His lung had collapsed, and every breath he took was trapping air inside his chest cavity, slowly crushing his heart. He had 3 minutes, maybe less, before his cardiac output failed entirely. She didn't have a chest tube. She didn't have a sterile tray. She had a field kit with gauze and basic sutures, but nothing to vent the pressure. Her eyes darted around the dim, leather-scented interior of the truck, landing on a heavy, stainless steel tactical pen clipped to the sun visor. "I need you to stay perfectly still," she commanded. Seo-jun's dark eyes flickered to hers, clouded with the fog of approaching death, yet he managed a single, agonizingly slow nod. Amara grabbed the pen, clicking it to retract the ink nib. She unscrewed the cap and the internal cartridge, leaving only a hollow, metallic tube. She doused it and her hands in a frantic burst of hand sanitizer from her kit, the stinging scent of alcohol filling the small space. With her left hand, she found the landmark, the second intercostal space, just above the third rib. Her fingers traced the line of a tattooed dragon's tail, the ink vibrant and mocking against the life-and-death reality of the moment. "This is going to hurt," she said, though she knew he could barely hear her. She didn't hesitate. With a focused, downward thrust, she drove the hollow metal casing through the muscle and into the pleural space. For a split second, there was only the resistance of tissue, and then, a sickening, audible hiss. It was the sound of life returning. The trapped air rushed out through the makeshift vent, and Seo-jun's chest suddenly heaved with a deep, shuddering intake of oxygen. The tension in his neck vanished. His eyes cleared, focusing on Amara with a startling, raw intensity. She held the pen in place with steady fingers, her navy scrubs now splattered with both rain and the dark crimson of his blood, creating a grim mosaic against the sterile blue fabric. She was a vision of controlled chaos, her braided bun slightly unraveled, a bead of sweat rolling down her temple despite the cold. As his breathing stabilized into a rhythmic, albeit painful, cadence, the silence between them grew heavy. The tiger on his chest seemed to breathe with him, moving under the translucent layer of blood and sweat. He looked at the woman who had just pierced his chest to save his soul, and for the first time, the stoic mask of the Syndicate had slipped. In its place was a silent, dangerous kind of wonder. Amara didn't pull away. She leaned in closer, checking his vitals, her doctor first, instinct still reigning supreme over the realization that she had just tied her fate to a man who lived by the sword. The wail of sirens finally cut through the heavy curtain of rain, a discordant melody that signaled the end of the isolation. Amara stepped back from the charcoal black truck, her boots sinking into the thick Georgia mud. Her hands were still raised, palms open in a universal gesture of peace, though her navy scrubs were a grisly map of the battle she had just fought. The blue and red strobes of the approaching patrol car danced off the wet pines, turning the dark forest into a fractured, neon nightmare. "Over here!" she shouted, her voice raspy from the cold and the adrenaline. She turned her head for a fleeting second to wave the officers down, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I have a critical patient. Tension pneumothorax, stable but high risk." The patrol car skidded to a halt, its headlights blinding her. Amara shielded her eyes, turning back toward the truck to give the officers a medical briefing, to tell them about the man with the dragons on his skin and the tactical pen still acting as his lifeline. But the darkness where the truck had sat was now a void. The realization didn't hit her with a crash, but with a sickening, hollow silence. The charcoal black pickup, the idling rumble of its diesel engine, and the man who had looked at her with the eyes of a dying king, everything was gone. There had been no screech of tires, no frantic getaway, no sound of a door slamming shut. It was as if the forest itself had reached out and swallowed the vehicle whole, leaving nothing behind but the scent of ozone and the relentless drumming of the rain. "Ma'am? Dispatch said you had a stalled vehicle?" The officer's voice was cautious, his flashlight beams slicing through the downpour. The light landed on Amara, illuminating the vivid dark smears of blood on her chest and the silver stethoscope glinting around her neck. Amara stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape. She looked at the empty shoulder of the road, then back at the officer. The truck, it was right here. He was shirtless, covered in tattoos. He was dying. The officer panned his light across the muddy embankment. There were faint, swirling ruts where heavy tires had been, but the rain was already filling them, washing away the evidence of a 3-ton machine. He looked at Amara, his expression shifting from professional concern to a deep, unsettling skepticism. There's no truck here, Doctor. Just your sedan and the woods? Amara ignored him, her doctor first, instinct driving her toward the spot where the truck's door had been. She dropped to her knees in the mud, her eyes searching the ground with clinical desperation. She needed proof that the last 20 minutes hadn't been a hallucination born of an 18-hour shift. And then she saw it. Snagged on a jagged, protruding root at the very edge of the ditch was a single, crumpled square of white gauze. It was heavy, sodden with rainwater, but the center was a deep, indelible crimson, the frantic signature of a man who had been seconds from death. Amara picked it up, the cold fabric sticking to her trembling fingers. She stared at the blood, the reality of the encounter settling into her bones like the winter chill. He was gone, erased by a machine she didn't understand, but the debt she had created was very much alive. The sterile white corridors of St. Jude's Trauma Center usually felt like home, a sanctuary of logic and light where every variable could be controlled. But as Dr. Amara Okoro walked her rounds 48 hours after the storm, the hospital felt transformed. The scent of antiseptic, once a comfort, now seemed to mask something sharper, something hidden. The logic was failing her. Every time a heavy set of double doors swung open, her heart stuttered, her eyes instinctively searching for the flash of a dragon's tail, or the stoic, weathered features of the man who had vanished into the rain. She felt the weight of a gaze everywhere. It was a prickle at the base of her neck when she charted in the nurse's station. It was the way a black sedan lingered a second too long in the ambulance bay before gliding silently into the night. Even the janitor, usually a font of local gossip, seemed to linger near her office with a newfound, silent intensity. Amara tried to convince herself it was the post-trauma buzz, the lingering adrenaline of a surgeon who had performed a roadside miracle, but her doctor first instinct told her otherwise. She wasn't just tired, she was being watched. When her shift finally ended at dawn, she retreated to the staff locker room, craving the mundane ritual of trading her navy scrubs for a sweater and jeans. The room was empty, the hum of the HVAC system the only sound in the hollow, metallic space. She spun the dial of her combination lock, the clicks echoing like small gunshots. As the locker door swung open, Amara froze. Resting atop her neatly folded civilian clothes was a small, velvet-lined box. It hadn't been there when she arrived. No one should have had her combination. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in black silk, sat a watch. It was a masterpiece of platinum and sapphire, a tourbillon movement that ticked with the silent, rhythmic grace of a predator. It was a piece of horological art worth more than her medical school debt, its face catching the harsh fluorescent light and throwing a cold, expensive glare against the locker walls. Tucked into the side of the box was a heavy, cream-colored cardstock note. There was no signature, no name, only 4 words written in elegant, hand-brushed ink that looked like it had been applied by a master of calligraphy. A debt is owed. Amara's breath hitched. She looked at the watch, then at the empty locker room door, her mind racing. The watch wasn't a gift, it was a mark. It was the confirmation that the man with the Irezumi tattoos wasn't a ghost of the Georgia woods, but a living, breathing power that had now reached into the most private corners of her life. She realized then that the Tiger of Seoul didn't just survive. He remembered. And in his world, a debt to a savior was a bond that could never be broken, whether she wanted it to be or not. The platinum watch sat on Amara's bedside table, its rhythmic ticking a constant, expensive heartbeat in the silence of her apartment. She couldn't bring herself to wear it, nor could she hide it away. It was a tether to a night that felt increasingly like a fever dream, a physical anchor to a man who shouldn't exist in her world of sterile gauze and surgical steel. Exhaustion pulled at her eyelids, but sleep was a distant country. She reached for the remote, seeking the mindless drone of the 24-hour news cycle to drown out her thoughts. The screen flickered to life, the blue light reflecting in her weary eyes. A breaking news banner flashed in stark crimson across the bottom of the screen. Violence in the city's North District has spiked following what intelligence sources call a power vacuum at the highest levels of the Korean Syndicate, the reporter said, her voice taut with professional urgency. Behind her, grainy footage of a police perimeter played, shattered glass, yellow tape, and the wreckage of a high-end sedan. Speculation continues to swirl regarding the whereabouts of the organization's enigmatic leader, Lee Seo-jun, known in the underworld as the Tiger of Seoul. Unconfirmed reports suggest an assassination attempt took place 3 nights ago on a remote stretch of highway. Amara's breath hitched. She sat upright, the remote trembling in her hand. The screen cut to a montage of file footage, blurry, long-lens shots of a man entering private clubs and blacked-out SUVs. Then, a still image appeared. It was a police evidence photo from a raid years prior, showing a man from the back, his shirt removed for processing. The breath left Amara's lungs in a sharp, cold rush. Even through the digital grain of the television, the artistry was unmistakable. The dragon's tail coiled exactly where her fingers had pressed to find a pulse. The tiger's head lunged across the same shoulder blade she had braced while driving a hollow pen into his chest. This wasn't just a patient. This was the man holding the city's fragile peace together with a fist of iron and ink. The tiger, she whispered to the empty room. The news report continued, detailing the Shadows, a rival faction notorious for their brutality, who were now moving in to claim Seo-jun's territory, convinced he was dead. They spoke of a war looming on the horizon, a conflict that would turn the streets into a graveyard. Amara looked from the television to the velvet box on her nightstand. She hadn't just saved a man, she had inadvertently preserved the apex predator of an empire. The doctor first instinct that had guided her on that dark road now felt like a heavy, golden chain. She had acted on principle, but the consequences were global. As the reporter spoke of the Shadows, hunting for any sign of Seo-jun's survival, Amara realized with a jolt of pure, icy dread that she wasn't just a witness to history. She was the reason the history book hadn't been closed. And if the rivals found out that the tiger was still breathing because of a surgeon in navy blue, the debt he owed her would be the least of her worries. The hospital's administrative wing was a ghost town after midnight, a labyrinth of dim corridors and locked doors that usually offered Amara a rare moment of peace. She sat behind her desk, the blue light of her monitor illuminating the dark circles beneath her eyes as she reviewed surgical schedules. The platinum watch sat in its velvet box inside her desk drawer, a leaden weight she couldn't ignore. The shift in the room was subtle, a change in air pressure, the faint scent of rain and expensive sandalwood, but Amara's doctor first instincts, sharpened by years of monitoring failing vitals, screamed a warning. She didn't look up immediately. She kept her eyes on the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The tactical pen was a clever choice, Doctor. Most surgeons would have waited for a kit that never came. The voice was low, melodic, and carried the weight of a command. Amara looked up. Lee Seo-jun stood by her office window, his silhouette cutting a sharp, lethal edge against the twinkling city lights. He was no longer the dying man in the mud. He was a king restored. He wore a charcoal gray silk suit that moved like liquid, the fabric straining slightly against his broad shoulders. The collar was open, revealing the tip of a black ink dragon's claw reaching toward his throat. "You shouldn't be here," Amara said, her voice steadier than she felt. She stood up, her navy scrubs a stark, professional contrast to his dark elegance. "You're a high-risk patient. You need a follow-up in a sterile environment, not a midnight break-in. Seo-jun stepped into the light. His weathered features were calm, but his eyes were hard. I am not here for a checkup, Dr. Okoro. I am here because the debt I owe you has become a death sentence. He moved to her desk, placing a hand on the mahogany surface. The men who attacked me, the shadows, they are not just criminals. They are scavengers. They found the clearing. They found the tire tracks. And they found the blood-stained gauze you left behind. Amara felt a cold chill wash over her. The police took that as evidence. The police are a sieve. Seo-jun countered, his voice dropping an octave. My rivals have eyes in every precinct. They know a professional saved me. They've traced the medical supplies in that clearing to this hospital's inventory. They know your name, Amara. They know your face. He reached into his jacket, and for a second, Amara feared he was drawing a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a small, encrypted burner phone and slid it across the desk toward her. They believe that by killing the woman who saved the tiger, they can prove that no one is safe under my protection, he said, his gaze locking onto hers. You acted out of mercy, but in my world, mercy is a vulnerability. They are coming for you, not to get to me, but to erase the miracle you performed. Amara looked at the phone, then back at him. The reality of her situation settled in. The hospital, her sanctuary, was no longer safe. She was a target in a war she didn't understand, protected only by the man who had brought the war to her doorstep. I won't leave my patients, she whispered. Seo-jun's expression didn't soften, but a flicker of something like respect crossed his eyes. I didn't expect you to. But when the lights go out and the code silver sounds, answer that phone. I am the only one who can lead you through the dark. The code silver didn't sound like a siren. It was a low, chilling chime followed by a mechanical voice that echoed through the sterile halls of St. Jude's. Lockdown initiated. Throughout the trauma center, heavy magnetic doors thudded shut, and steel security shutters began their slow, grinding descent over the glass entryways. Amara stood in the center of the darkened intensive care wing, the burner phone Seo-jun had given her vibrating with a violent, rhythmic persistence in her scrub pocket. Outside the reinforced glass of the unit, the shadows had arrived. They weren't the chaotic thugs she had imagined. They moved with a terrifying, military precision. Clad in tactical black, their faces obscured by ballistic masks, they didn't look like gang members. They looked like an erasure squad. The flickering fluorescent lights of the hallway glinted off the suppressed barrels of their weapons. They weren't there to rob the pharmacy or take hostages. They were there to finish a job the Georgia rain had interrupted. Amara looked toward the end of the hall. A security stairwell door was still propped open by a stray gurney, a clear, unguarded exit that led straight to the ambulance bay and the safety of the night. Her heart screamed at her to run, to let the monsters hunt each other in the dark and preserve the life she had worked so hard to build. But then she looked into the shadows of the recovery suite behind her. Lee Seo-jun was there, seated on the edge of a clinical bed. He had ignored the warning to flee. His charcoal suit jacket was off, thrown over a chair, revealing the white bandages she had applied just days ago. They were already beginning to bloom with a fresh, dark crimson. The strain of the last hour had reopened his wounds, and though his eyes were as sharp as a predator's, his breathing was labored. He was holding a sleek, black handgun with the same detached professionalism Amara used to hold the scalpel. He was the tiger, but he was a wounded one, cornered in a cage of glass and steel. Go, Amara, he said, his voice a gravelly rasp that barely carried over the hum of the hospital's emergency generators. They want the man who survived. If you are not with me, you are just another doctor caught in the crossfire. Take the stairs. Amara looked at the open stairwell, then back at the man who had walked into her life with a map of dragons on his skin. Her doctor first. Instinct flickered, then roared into a white-hot flame. To her, a patient didn't stop being a patient just because the shadows were at the door. If she left now, Seo-jun wouldn't just die. He would be slaughtered on a bed she had sworn to keep sterile. "I don't leave my patients," she whispered, the words a vow. She didn't run for the stairs. Instead, she kicked the gurney away, letting the heavy security door slam shut and lock with a definitive, hydraulic hiss. She turned towards Seo-jun, her face set in the same calm, intense expression she wore during a grade 4 hemorrhage. She reached for a tray of surgical supplies, her mind already racing through the hospital's layout. If they wanted the tiger, they would have to go through the surgeon first. She wasn't a soldier, but she knew this building better than any assassin ever could. In the dim, red glow of the emergency lights, the choice was made. She would protect the life she had saved, no matter the cost. The heavy magnetic doors groaned under the rhythmic strike of a battering ram, a sound that vibrated through the floor tiles and into the soles of Amara's feet. She didn't have a firearm, and she didn't have the strength to hold a line against professional killers, but she had something they lacked: total mastery over the atmospheric and chemical composition of the wing. To the shadows, this was a hallway. To Amara, it was a pressurized vessel filled with volatile possibilities. "Stay down," she commanded Seo-jun, her voice dropping into the low, clipped tone she used during a mid-surgery crisis. She didn't wait for his response. She sprinted to the anesthesia workstation at the head of the corridor, her fingers dancing over the touch screens with a blurring, practiced speed. She bypassed the safety protocols, a feat only possible for someone who understood the internal architecture of the hospital's gas manifold. With a series of sharp turns on the manual flow meters, she flooded the localized HVAC vents for the external corridor with a concentrated surge of sevoflurane, a potent inhalation anesthetic. It was colorless and sweet-smelling, a silent, invisible tide meant to induce unconsciousness in seconds. "What are you doing?" Seo-jun asked, his hand tightening on his weapon as he watched the monitor. "I'm changing the environment," Amara replied, her eyes fixed on the security feed. On the grainy screen, the lead assassin managed to breach the first set of doors, stepping into the hallway with his suppressed rifle leveled. He took 3 steps before the gas hit. His movements slowed, becoming heavy and disjointed, as if he were walking through deep water. Behind him, 2 others stumbled, their gloved hands clawing at their throat mic collars before they collapsed in a heap of tactical gear and silenced steel. But Amara wasn't finished. She knew the shadows would have backup, and she knew the gas would eventually dissipate. She grabbed a liter bottle of 99% isopropyl alcohol from the sterilization cart and doused the linoleum floor just beyond the inner door. She then reached for a high-wattage surgical heat lamp, snapping the safety guard off the bulb. "When they break the inner seal, the spark from the door's magnetic release will hit the vapor," she explained, her face illuminated by the red emergency lights. She wasn't a soldier, but she was a scientist, and she understood that the difference between a medicine and a weapon was purely a matter of dosage and delivery. Seo-jun watched her, a dark flicker of realization crossing his features. He had spent his life surrounded by men who used lead and blade to settle debts, but he had never seen a woman turn a house of healing into a tactical nightmare. She moved with a cold, lethal elegance, her navy scrubs stained with his blood, looking less like a victim and more like the architect of their survival. The inner doors hissed, the magnets struggling as the second wave of hitters bypassed their fallen comrades. Amara grabbed Seo-jun's arm, pulling him toward the service elevator. "No," she whispered. As the doors finally gave way, a sudden, muffled whoosh of blue flame erupted in the corridor, not a bomb, but a rapid-fire chemical flash designed to blind and disorient. In the chaos of smoke and falling shadows, the doctor and the kings slipped into the dark, proving that in a war of attrition, the one who knows how the body works is the most dangerous person in the room. The service elevator groaned to a halt in the sub-basement, the doors sliding open to reveal a loading dock bathed in the harsh, rhythmic pulse of amber emergency lights. Amara stepped out first, her hand firm on Seo-jun's shoulder, guiding his uneven weight. She was no longer just a surgeon, she was a shield. Behind them, the muffled echoes of the chemical flash and the shouts of disoriented men faded, replaced by the heavy, synchronized thrum of approaching engines. 4 black SUVs roared into the loading bay, tires screeching against the concrete in a perfect, aggressive formation. Before the vehicles even fully stopped, a dozen men in dark, tailored suits spilled out, their movements a mirror of the military precision the shadows had displayed, but with an underlying ferocity that belonged only to the tiger's pride. They didn't hesitate. One group formed a living wall around the elevator bank, while another swept the perimeter with cold, practiced efficiency. The leader of the unit, a man with a jagged scar across his brow, sprinted toward them, his weapon lowered in a gesture of absolute subservience. He dropped to one knee before Seo-jun, his head bowed. "This city is secure, Chairman. The shadows have been purged. We are here to take you home." Seo-jun didn't move. He leaned against the cold concrete pillar, his chest heaving, the white bandages Amara had applied now a deep, uniform crimson. He looked at his men, the weapons, the power, the empire he had built, and then he looked back at the woman standing beside him. Amara didn't flinch at the sight of the gunman. She didn't look for a way to run. She stood with her feet planted, her navy scrubs splattered with a mosaic of chemical residue and blood, her stethoscope still draped around her neck like a silver torque. In her right hand she still clutched a surgical tray, her fingers white-knuckled around the edge. She looked like a general surveying a battlefield she had just won, her eyes burning with a fierce, professional fire that demanded order even in the heart of chaos. "The chairman is in hypovolemic shock," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. She wasn't asking for permission, she was issuing a directive to a room full of killers. "He needs a level 1 trauma suite and a full transfusion. If you move him without a stabilized 4, you'll be carrying a corpse." The men in suits hesitated, looking to their leader for guidance. But Seo-jun raised a trembling hand, silencing them. He looked at Amara, and for the first time, the guarded, stoic mask of the Syndicate head vanished completely. In its place was a raw, piercing clarity. He didn't see a Good Samaritan anymore. He didn't see a doctor who had happened to be on the right road at the wrong time. He saw a contemporary. He realized that while he ruled through fear and silver, she ruled through life and death. She had walked into his war unarmed and had dismantled his enemies using nothing but the laws of biology and the strength of her will. In that moment, the debt was no longer a matter of money or protection. It was a recognition of souls. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect he had never offered to any rival or ally. He wasn't looking at a victim he had to protect. He was looking at an equal who had chosen to stand in the fire with him. "Do as the doctor says," Seo-jun rasped, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "In this building, her word is law." The high-pitched hum of the trauma center had returned to its usual, frantic equilibrium. The bullet holes in the administrative wing had been patched, the scorch marks from the chemical flash scrubbed away, and the code silver had become a hushed legend whispered among the night shift nurses. Dr. Amara Okoro stood by the window of the break room, watching the sunrise bleed gold over the Georgia pines, the same pines that had once hidden a dying king in a charcoal black truck. On her wrist she didn't wear the platinum watch. It sat in a secure vault, its value destined for a new community clinic in the North District. Instead, she wore her simple, digital work watch, its ticking a humble reminder of the seconds she had fought to steal back from death. Her hands, once stained with the blood of the Tiger of Seoul, were clean and steady as she sipped her coffee. She often thought about the thin, jagged lines she had walked that night. In the quiet moments between surgeries, the question haunted the edges of her mind: did I save a man, or did I preserve a monster? She knew Lee Seo-jun was a predator, a man who dealt in shadows and silver. By stitching him back together, she had arguably allowed his empire to continue its reign. To some, her mercy was a mistake. To others, it was a betrayal of the very society she served. But as she looked at her reflection in the glass, she saw the answer in the doctor first. instinct that still burned in her eyes. The Hippocratic Oath didn't come with a background check. It didn't ask for a list of virtues before a bandage was applied. Medicine was, and had to remain, beautifully, terrifyingly blind. A heartbeat didn't have a moral code. A collapsed lung didn't carry a criminal record. If she had begun to choose who was worthy of her skill, she would have ceased to be a healer and become a judge, and that was a weight no human was meant to carry. In the end, Amara realized that by saving Seo-jun, she hadn't just saved a syndicate head, she had saved herself from becoming the very thing she fought against, someone who decides whose life has value. She had looked into the eyes of a monster, and seen only a patient, and in doing so, she had maintained the sanctity of the only world she knew. Mercy, she understood now, wasn't about the person receiving it, it was about the person giving it. It was the refusal to let the darkness of the world dim the light of one's own principles. The city remained a place of secrets and wars, and the tiger still roamed his concrete jungle. But in the halls of St. Jude's, there was a peace that passed understanding. Amara set her coffee down and turned as her pager chirped. A new trauma, a new life, a new chance to prove that the light of healing should never, ever be extinguished.